with bodybuilders, what approaches do you guys take for prescribing proximity to failure? Like if you're working with a novice, intermediate, advanced athlete, does your approach change based off of that scenario?
If I understand your question correctly, Brian, I'll throw you a couple of scenarios. So like it depends largely on what the session looks like for each of those bodybuilders, right? So like for your typical beginner / novice who's used to like basically pushing failure on everything, right? If I have a particular session started out with 2 compound movements and then 3 finishers that are bodybuilding, I'm going to frame it to them such that, look, I don't want you shooting your wad and hitting failure on leg press and squat before we get to the actual, bodybuilding exercises, right? So, that's the kind of person I'm going to frame it that way. I'm going to say, look, don't use all your ammunition on that very first set.
Yeah.
You're going to be wasted, by the time that you get to the stuff that's actually bodybuilding. Whereas with that particular session in somebody that's more advanced, I might have to frame it the other way. I might have to say, look, don't conserve too much energy on those first couple of sets, right? I want effort there. I want you trying hard because it gets you in that sweet spot for those muscle building sets to where you don't have to do 20 sets of leg extensions, 20 reps of leg extensions, right? We can kind of get appropriate effort there to where we're going to be able to get the stimulus that we need in a shorter period of time when we get to, those muscle building sets. So I hope that I answered your question, but for me, it's kind of easier to kind of use a given session for each kind of an athlete.
I think, that makes sense what you're saying. I think where I'm in the back of my mind when I ask that question is a novice, in order for RIR and RPE to work, which I just realized we haven't really even defined what this is. So like RPE,
good point.
RPE is stands for rating of perceived exertion. So usually it's a scale from 5 to 10, 7 to 10, somewhere in there. And it's just a rating of difficulty. 9 is typically considered like 1 rep in the tank. 8's considered 2. So on 10 would be max effort, like last completed rep you can do. And then RIR for practical purposes will define is just sort of the inverse of that, but accomplishing the same thing. I think it's personally a little bit more intuitive, especially for bodybuilders that didn't kind of come up using RPE, like a lot of powerlifters may have. So RIR is just reps in reserve. So you leave a 0 RIR would be the last rep you can complete. 1 RIR, you're leaving 1 rep in the tank. So where I'm kind of coming from this question is, in order to judge that, we need to know what max effort feels like, right? And so that's kind of our anchor from which we're measuring all of this. And so I think it can be a disservice for some novices to use RIR when they don't really know, like sometimes they need encouragement to actually
you have
push.
To teach them how to
train
actually
hard.
Go to failure.
Exactly.
Exactly. Because, novices and intermediates, like their failure, like their defined failure is going to look different than maybe someone who's far more advanced.
Yeah.
Is the form and technique good from A to B?
Yeah.
And are they truly going to failure? So it's actually teaching them that skill, because how do you gauge what 2 reps in the tank feels like if you don't even know what failure is?
Yeah. Exactly.
So that's the first teaching tool, is like teaching them how to actually train hard. Sometimes, maybe they are training too hard. It's like, okay, we need to back off.
Yeah.
But in most cases, you have to push people. You have to teach them how to actually do that. So watching form videos is pretty important. And that's why when I program someone who's fairly new or even intermediate, like I'll make the program very basic, very simplistic. And if I'm going to teach them how to get to failure, it's going to be on, let's say, a lateral or a curl or a tricep press down. It's not going to be on a squat or a deadlift, obviously. Like, we don't want them to get injured. But I'm going to take these smaller exercises and watch how they train. Because oftentimes when you're watching that, and especially if you're watching it with them, you could point out things like, hey, I need you to move this way. I need you to slow the rep speed down here, or what have you. Or, hey, I want you to, we need to push one more rep out here. We need to compose your mental your processes, control your breathing. Maybe take a slight pause here so you can get that one true rep that's going to get you to failure. And then a lot of the principles that you're using for maybe like a lateral, you can start applying to other exercises, because a lot of it's just principle based.
That's a great point.
So that's kind of like the first step. That's like the first step. And then from there, like when you program, you got to think about, okay, if I do have an athlete going to failure on some of these, how's that going to impact the exercises that follow? How that's going to impact the next training session,
week
or two, or week, like you just mentioned, Brad. Sometimes even, further out than that, like a month. So that's kind of how I kind of think about it. It's like, okay, let's see if they know it.
Yeah.
Like going to failure actually feels like, and if they don't, then we need to teach that.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's research on comparing like novices to well-trained athletes and where bar speed is in relation to their like max effort. And it seems as if advanced athletes can, their RPE 10, for example, there's an observed lower bar speed than there would be for somebody who's novice. So which makes sense.
Makes sense.
So
yeah.
like if you're a novice, what feels like an RPE 10, it might look like 5 in the tank visually for somebody with a trained eye for it. And I don't know if I've told this story on this podcast before or not, but when my wife Kelsey and I started dating, we were training at like a 24-hour fitness one time, and she was doing like pec deck, and I was training with her, and I said, okay, I want you to do 10 here. And she got to like 9. I'm like, all right. And then she hits 10, and she's like, okay, that's all I can do. And I was like, wait, if you do like 10 more, we'll get a puppy. Like, not thinking like, not thinking there's no way in hell that she's going to get 10 more and she just kept going, It's, and we already had a dog at this point. So I think she didn't hold me to it, but it goes to show like novice athletes, beginners, there's a degree of skill required to push to failure, but there's also you're usually stronger than you realize out of the gate, even with that being said. So I think I tend to prescribe, if I'm using RIR, probably lower RIRs than I may for an advanced athlete early on, just because I know that, I'm not going to have a novice train squats to failure just because that's, so I might say, okay, 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, just knowing that it's going to at least push them in that direction to kind of gain that skill set.
Close enough. Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think.
Do you take the rep ranges into consideration? Like I'll base like reps in reserve based on a rep range that we're using.
Yeah.
Like higher rep ranges, I know, okay, I need to get them closer to failure.
Yeah. And so
in order to get that motor recruitment.
Yeah.
Or if we're lower rep ranges, I know if I assign, let's say 3 in the tank, I'm pretty safe knowing that I'm going to probably get enough stimulus out of that.
For sure. I think when it comes to kind of the physiological underpinnings of this, it makes sense why that would be true. If you recruit based off of the force demand that's presented, to meet or maintain force output. So if you're doing like a 5 rep max, you're going to get close to full recruitment, or you probably will get full recruitment out of the gate, from rep 1 on.
Okay,
so you're getting mechanical
1,
tension regardless. And so, the meta regression that Zach Robinson, he's with Data Driven Strength, that he published, I think it was last year, they showed, there's likely a benefit training a little bit closer to failure for hypertrophy, but the relationship wasn't as strong when the sets were lower rep. So with heavier loads, it seems that you can get away with training probably a little bit further from failure than you can with like a 20 rep set, for example. So, which makes sense when you kind of understand what causes mechanical tension, So yeah, I to answer your question, I do consider that. And also the movement being performed, even if it's a squat and we're opening with a squat, kind of as Brad alluded to earlier, if I have them train really close to failure on their first exercise, then that total area under the curve is going to be less because they're going to sabotage their, secondary and third movements that they're performing, and they're just not going to have anything left in the tank. So yeah, I tend to be on average, a little bit more submaximal out of the gate, especially if the reps are more moderate. And then kind of as the session goes on, I might push people a little bit closer to failure. What about you guys?
Well, I was going to ask you guys, getting back to the baseline. Do you ever have athletes that are, unfamiliar with RIR, just like do an introductory week where they just do one set of everything to failure to kind of get them somewhat familiar with it?
Yeah, I think I have done that. And I think there's pros and cons to that. Usually I oftentimes won't open with that because I want to make sure they can go to failure safely. I don't want them doing it, in this reckless form. So once I trust that they're proficient enough in a movement where, we're hitting the target musculature, the way we want, then yeah, I think there's advantages of that. And I still think there's advantages like, near the end of a session, the last set of a muscle group, I oftentimes have people just take it to the house and see, if they can beat a prior performance or something like that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of utility to getting them comfortable with how failure feels early in their training career. And I think that's where some people are inadvertently kind of falling short when they're starting out right now, because there's so much information out there now about this that, we'll get the question, someone who's been training a year, like, was this a 4 or was this a 5 RIR? And I'm like, we're asking the wrong questions here. It doesn't matter really. Like it's not like there's this tipping point where it's like all of a sudden this rep is now effective, like this line in the sand. There's, a spectrum and like there's kind of a sweet spot where you want to be pushing enough where velocity starts to go down. That's sort of where I conceptualize where things are probably productive at that point.
Because it's challenging though, even for me, training 38 years, I like if you told me, hey Jeff, I need you to leave 4 in the tank here or 5 in the tank, I'm gonna have a hard time even now, like knowing what that is.
Same.
Is it gonna be? It's gonna be 3.
Yeah.
Is it gonna be 4, 5? I mean, you tell me 3, I think I could probably gauge that pretty closely. It's gonna end up probably being 2 or 3 maybe in the tank. If you tell me 1 in the tank, it's probably gonna be 1 in the tank.
Yeah.
Like 99% of the time, I would be pretty accurate with that. But to ask someone who's relatively new to the game or even intermediate, like, hey, we need 4 to 5 in the tank here. Like,
it's tough.
Like you said, it's going to be a really gray area there.
Yeah.
So when I program reps in reserve, like I just base it on a rep range that I'm like assigning, and I'll just like make sure that it's going to be hard enough to where I know the effort level is going to be appropriate.
Exactly.
And I try to simplify it for people as much as possible. So they're not in the, like, how many times have you seen people in the gym, like commercial gyms, you see guys kind of just going through the motion, like they lift the same all the time. Like, they're not logbooking anything.
Yeah.
But then you see other guys that are like, kind of like concentrating, like they're not concentrating on like the form and quality. They're like, was that 4?
Yeah.
Was that 3? Was it 2?
They're auditing.
Like, we don't want that.
Yeah.
That's counterproductive too. Like, I would rather just say, I need you to go as much as you can get, but before you think you're going to fail, just stop. Like, just leave 1 there so you don't get hurt. Yeah. Because eventually they're going to be able to gauge where true failure is at.
Yeah. No, I think that's
I have a...
Go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was just going to say, once I kind of am with somebody for a while, and to really kind of drive the point home of Jeff, like you were saying, to leave 4 reps in reserve, that's, really vague. But I've got a little table that I will create for people, especially when I can tell they're visual. When they're visual like me and they really kind of understand things when they see like numbers and things like that, I've got this little table where I say, okay, now this is the week that we talked about, where I want you using a load, that's like a 12 rep max on everything. And I want you going to failure to where you cannot get another one. Of course, I'm very, very cautious. Okay, let's make sure that you can bottom out on the leg press and still get out from underneath the thing so that you don't get squished. I don't do this with squats. And, even though bench presses is a really good way to tell when you're close to failure, I usually don't, because I don't really trust your average spotter in the gym. But I have a little table, and once I'll kind of say, okay, with this load, you got 15 reps, which basically means, and then I can just copy and paste. 14's 1 RIR, 13's 2 RIR, 12 is 3 RIR, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And once they lay that out, and I got to have that all plugged into their table, they start understanding the concept of 4 RIR, 5 RIR, et cetera, and then what that feels like, And then of course, now they're kind of able to not only understand RIR better, but kind of what I think of as the backwards of RIR is RPE. Because I always think in terms of 10. If it's a 10 rep max, if I got 9, it's 1 RIR, that's an RPE 9, right? If I got 8, well, that's an RPE 8, that's 2 RIR. And once I can visually lay that out for them, it's like the little light bulb comes on, and they kind of understand it better. Now, they don't really understand why I want them training to 4 RIR. They don't understand why, I want them to leave 4 reps in reserve, et cetera. But at least they understand the concept better. And that was kind of the point that I wanted to make from that.